Matt's mind raced as he stared at the dagger on the altar, Ethan's words echoing in his head. Submit to the house's will, or be consumed by it. He couldn't accept either outcome. There had to be another way, a way to escape this nightmare. But as he stood there, the oppressive energy of the house pressed down on him, sapping his strength and clouding his thoughts. The symbols on the altar pulsed more intensely, their light growing brighter as if urging him to take the dagger. The air was thick with a sense of inevitability, as if the house itself was pushing him toward a decision. Ethan's voice cut through the haze. It's the only way, Matt. Take the dagger. Embrace the power. Join me. Matt's hands shook as he reached out toward the dagger, the weight of the choice bearing down on him. He could feel the dark energy radiating from the blade, the power that had corrupted Ethan and countless others before him. If he took it, he would be surrendering to the house, becoming part of the very thing he had fought to escape. But if he refused, he knew the house would destroy him. His fingers brushed against the hilt of the dagger, and a jolt of icy cold shot through his arm. The symbols on the altar flared with a blinding light, and Matt felt a surge of dark energy pulse through him, filling him with a cold, hollow power. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment, the house's heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ethan's voice was soft, almost tender. Do it, Matt. Accept your fate. For a moment, Matt was tempted. The power of the house called to him, offering him strength and control in exchange for his submission. But deep down, he knew that if he gave in, he would lose himself completely, becoming nothing more than a puppet of the house's malevolence. With a final surge of defiance, Matt wrenched his hand away from the dagger. No, he said, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped him. I won't be like you. Ethan's expression twisted into a snarl of rage. You fool, he spat. You can't fight the house. You'll die here, just like the others. Matt didn't respond. He turned and sprinted toward the exit, the symbols on the altar flaring one last time as he fled the chamber. The house seemed to shake with fury, the walls trembling as he raced down the corridor, the heartbeat pounding louder and louder in his ears. He didn't look back. He couldn't. All that mattered was finding a way out before the house claimed him for good. Matt's flight through the twisting corridors was a blur of terror and adrenaline. The house was in chaos, the walls buckling and shifting as if trying to crush him. The once solid floors cracked and split open, revealing dark chasms that threatened to swallow him whole. The heartbeat of the house was deafening now, a relentless thudding that reverberated through his entire being. He stumbled and nearly fell as the floor beneath him tilted, sending him careening into the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he forced himself to keep moving, driven by sheer survival instinct. The corridor was collapsing around him, the house tearing itself apart in its fury. Ahead, he saw a faint light, an opening that led to what looked like another part of the house. Perhaps even an exit. Hope flared in his chest, and he pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overtake him. But as he neared the light, the walls of the corridor began to close in, the ceiling lowering as if trying to crush him. The path was narrowing, the light growing smaller and smaller. Matt knew. He had only seconds before the house sealed him in for good. With one final burst of energy, he dove toward the opening, throwing himself through the narrow gap just as the walls slammed shut behind him. He landed hard on the other side, skidding across the floor and coming to a stop in a dimly lit room. For a moment, he lay there, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The heartbeat of the house was still loud in his ears, but it was growing fainter, as if the house was losing its hold on him. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his muscles protesting with every movement. He was in a small, plain room with a single door on the far side. The light filtering in from above was weak but steady, a stark contrast to the chaotic darkness he had just escaped. Matt forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't know where the door led, but he knew he had to keep moving. The house wasn't done with him yet, not by a long shot. He took a deep breath and crossed the room, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. Whatever lay beyond this door, it couldn't be worse than what he had just endured. He had to believe that. With a final glance back at the darkened corridor, Matt opened the door and stepped through, into whatever new horror awaited him. Matt emerged from the narrow doorway into a vast, dark space that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of decay and something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. The faint, sickly green glow that had illuminated the previous corridors was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He stood at the edge of what felt like a massive chasm, the ground beneath his feet slick and uneven. The floor seemed to slope downward, leading into the blackness that swallowed everything beyond the small circle of light that radiated from the doorway behind him. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Matt could just make out the faint outlines of what appeared to be twisted, organic shapes rising from the ground, like the skeletal remains of some long-dead forest. A deep, rhythmic thumping echoed through the space, a low, pulsing sound that reverberated in Matt's chest like the beat of a massive, unseen heart. The sound was distant at first, but with each passing moment, it grew louder and more insistent, as if the very ground beneath him was alive and throbbing with malevolent energy. Matt's instincts screamed at him to turn back, to flee this place and never look back. But he knew there was no going back, not now. The house had led him here for a reason, and whatever awaited him in the darkness was something he had to face if he ever hoped to escape. Steeling himself, Matt began to descend into the abyss, carefully picking his way down the sloping, treacherous ground. The further he went, the steeper the incline became, until he was practically sliding down the slick, uneven surface. The air grew colder as he descended, and the darkness thickened, becoming almost tangible, as if it were a living thing that sought to swallow him whole. The heartbeat grew louder, more distinct, and Matt could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath his feet, pulsing in time with his own rapid heartbeat. The walls of the chasm seemed to close in around him, the space narrowing until he was forced to squeeze through tight, constricting passages that left him gasping for breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ground leveled out, and Matt found himself standing on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast, subterranean cavern. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with strange, pulsating veins that glowed with a faint, sickly light. The air was thick with a damp, fetid odor, and the sound of the heartbeat was deafening, reverberating off the walls in a continuous, relentless rhythm. At the center of the cavern, directly beneath the source of the heartbeat, stood a massive, ornate altar, carved from dark, glossy stone. The altar was covered in strange, intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and twist as Matt looked at them, their meaning just beyond his grasp. The very air around the altar seemed to shimmer with dark energy, a palpable force that made Matt's skin crawl. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the heart of the house, the source of its power, the place where its dark energy was concentrated. And he knew that whatever he had to do to escape, it would happen here. Matt hesitated at the edge of the cavern, his eyes locked on the altar at its center. He could feel the dark energy radiating from it, a cold, oppressive force that threatened to overwhelm him. The heartbeat thudded in his ears, louder and more insistent, as if urging him to move forward, to embrace the darkness that awaited him. But something held him back. A sense of dread, of impending doom, that made every fiber of his being scream in protest. He was on the brink of something terrible, something that would change him forever if he stepped into that cavern. Just as he was about to turn back, to retreat to the relative safety of the narrow ledge, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Matt froze, his heart skipping a beat as he strained to see through the darkness. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light shadows shifting in the dim, flickering glow of the cavern walls. But then he saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, their forms twisted and grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. They moved slowly, deliberately, their bodies contorted in ways that defied human anatomy. Their skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Their eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through him, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Matt's breath caught in his throat as the figures drew closer, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. They were like marionettes, their strings pulled by the house itself, their every motion dictated by its dark will. The figures circled the altar, their empty eyes fixed on Matt as they moved in unison, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the heartbeat that filled the cavern. It was as if they were performing some kind of ritual, a dance of death that he had been drawn into, whether he wanted to be or not. The closer they came, the stronger the pull of the altar became. Matt could feel it tugging at him, drawing him in with an irresistible force. The air around him crackled with dark energy, and he could feel the house tightening its grip on him, trying to bend him to its will. He took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what to do. He couldn't stay here, but he couldn't move forward either. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes locked on him, and he knew that if they reached him, there would be no escape. His only chance was to reach the altar, to confront whatever power lay at the heart of the house, and to find a way to break its hold on him. But to do that, he would have to pass through the ring of figures that surrounded it, to step into the very heart of the darkness that sought to consume him. With a deep breath, Matt steeled himself and took a step forward, toward the altar and the figures that circled it. As Matt approached the altar, the figures parted, creating a narrow path that led directly to its center. Their empty eyes followed him as he walked, their bodies swaying in time with the relentless thudding of the house's heartbeat. The closer he came, the stronger the pull of the altar became, until it felt like a physical force dragging him forward, compelling him to complete whatever dark ritual was about to take place. When he reached the altar, Matt hesitated, his hand hovering just above its surface. The symbols carved into the stone glowed with a faint, eerie light, and the air around it was thick with a palpable, malevolent energy. It was as if the altar itself was alive, pulsing with the dark power of the house. Matt's gaze was drawn to the dagger lying atop the altar. It was a large, ornate blade, its hilt adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. The blade itself was dark and glossy, stained with what looked like dried blood. It was a weapon of sacrifice, a tool of death, and Matt knew instinctively that it was meant for him. He could feel the weight of the house's expectations pressing down on him, urging him to take the dagger, to complete the ritual that had been set in motion. The figures surrounding the altar watched in silence, their hollow eyes fixed on him, waiting for him to make his move. But as Matt reached for the dagger, he heard a voice, low, smooth, and filled with a cold, cruel amusement. "Do you see it now, Matt? The truth of this place?" Matt froze, his hand inches from the dagger, and looked up to see Ethan standing at the edge of the cavern, his tall, thin figure barely visible in the dim light. His eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger, and his smile was cold and mocking. "This house," Ethan continued, his voice echoing through the cavern, "is a living thing, a creature that feeds on fear, on suffering. And you, Matt, you've been chosen to be part of it." Matt's stomach twisted with fear and revulsion. Chosen, he whispered, his voice trembling. For what? Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. To become one with the house, he said, his tone almost reverent. To join me in serving its will, in feeding it with the fear and pain of those who are drawn here. It's a great honor, Matt, one that I once resisted, just as you are now. But in the end, the house always wins. Matt's mind raced as he tried to process what Ethan was saying. You did this, he said, his voice thick with anger and betrayal. You brought me here. Ethan's smile widened. I didn't bring you here, Matt. The house did. It saw your fear, your weakness, and it drew you in, just as it did with me. You can't escape it, Matt. None of us can. The weight of Ethan's words settled on Matt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He looked down at the dagger, the symbols on the altar glowing brighter, almost urging him to take it. The house's heartbeat thudded in his ears, a relentless drumbeat that seemed to echo through his very soul. For a moment, Matt was tempted. The power of the house called to him, offering him strength and control in exchange for his submission. He could feel it wrapping around him like a shroud, promising to take away his fear, his pain, if only he would surrender. But deep down, Matt knew that if he gave in, he would lose himself completely, becoming nothing more than a puppet of the house's malevolence. No, Matt said, his voice firm despite the fear that gripped him. I won't be like you. I won't become part of this. Ethan's expression darkened, and his voice took on a more sinister tone. You don't have a choice, Matt. The house has chosen you. You can't fight it. Matt's mind raced as he looked between Ethan and the altar, the weight of the choice bearing down on him. Submit to the house's will, or be consumed by it. He couldn't accept either outcome. There had to be another way, a way to escape this nightmare. But as he stood there, the oppressive energy of the house pressed down on him, sapping his strength and clouding his thoughts. The figures around the altar swayed in time with the heartbeat, their hollow eyes watching him with a silent intensity. The air was thick with a sense of inevitability, as if the house itself was pushing him toward a decision. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes gleaming with a cold, malicious light. Take the dagger, Matt, he urged, his voice low and coaxing. Embrace the power. Join me. Matt's hands shook as he reached out toward the dagger, the weight of the house's expectations pressing down on him. The symbols on the altar pulsed with a blinding light, and Matt felt a surge of dark energy pulse through him, filling him with a cold, hollow power. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment, the house's heartbeat pounding in his ears. But as his fingers brushed against the hilt of the dagger, Matt felt a jolt of icy cold shoot through his arm. The sensation was sharp, almost painful, and it snapped him out of the haze that had settled over him. In that moment, he knew that if he took the dagger, he would be lost, just like Ethan, just like the figures that surrounded the altar. With a final surge of defiance, Matt wrenched his hand away from the dagger. No, he said, his voice steady. I won't do it. I won't become part of this. Ethan's face twisted into a snarl of rage. You fool, he spat. You can't fight the house. You don't know what you're up against. Matt took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Maybe I don't, he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. But I'm not going to give in. I won't let this place take me. Ethan's eyes narrowed, and he lunged at Matt with a sudden, terrifying speed. Matt barely had time to react. He grabbed the dagger off the altar and swung it toward Ethan, the blade catching the dim light of the cavern as it sliced through the air. The dagger struck Ethan in the chest, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan's eyes widened in shock and pain, and he staggered back, clutching the wound as dark, thick blood began to pour from it. But instead of falling, Ethan's body began to dissolve, breaking apart into shadows that swirled and twisted before being absorbed into the darkness of the cavern. His voice echoed through the chamber, filled with rage and despair. "You can't escape, Matt. The house will never let you go." And then he was gone, his voice fading into the distance, leaving Matt alone in the cavern. For a moment, Matt stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline coursed through his veins. The cavern was eerily silent, the heartbeat of the house momentarily stilled. But Matt knew it wasn't over, not yet. The ground beneath him trembled, and the walls of the cavern began to shake. The symbols on the altar flared with a blinding light, and Matt could feel the energy of the house shifting, growing unstable. The heartbeat returned, faster and more erratic, as if the house itself was panicking, trying to hold itself together. But it was too late. The power that had been concentrated at the altar was unraveling, and the house was beginning to collapse. Matt didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted toward the exit, the dagger still clutched tightly in his hand. The ground buckled beneath him as the cavern began to crumble, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling and crashing to the ground around him. The walls cracked and split open, revealing dark, gaping chasms that seemed to reach down into infinity. The heartbeat grew louder, more frantic, as if the house was trying to pull itself back together, to stop the destruction that had been set in motion. But Matt knew that the house's power had been broken, it could no longer hold him here. He reached the narrow ledge that led back up to the twisting corridors above, and without looking back, he began to climb. The ground shook beneath him, and the walls groaned as they continued to collapse, but Matt kept moving, driven by a single, overwhelming instinct: survival. The climb was treacherous, the path unstable and crumbling, but Matt pushed himself forward, his muscles burning with the effort. The heartbeat of the house was a constant, deafening roar in his ears, but he forced himself to block it out, focusing only on reaching the surface, on escaping the nightmare that had nearly consumed him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Matt reached the top of the incline and stumbled into a familiar corridor. The walls were cracked and splintering, the floor shifting beneath his feet, but it was a path, an escape route. He didn't know where it would lead, but he didn't care. As long as it took him away from the heart of the house, away from the altar and the dark power that had tried to claim him, it was enough. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as the corridor twisted and turned around him. The house was still trying to stop him, to trap him within its collapsing walls, but Matt was determined. He could feel the darkness receding, the oppressive weight lifting as he moved further away from the source of the house's power. And then, just as he thought he couldn't run any further, he saw it, a faint, pale light up ahead, filtering through the cracks in the walls. The sight filled him with renewed energy, and he pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overtake him. The light grew brighter as he approached, and he realized with a jolt of relief that it was daylight, real, honest daylight, shining down through a gap in the crumbling ceiling. He was almost there. With one final burst of energy, Matt sprinted toward the light, leaping through the narrow opening just as the corridor behind him collapsed in a shower of rubble and dust. He landed hard on the ground outside, the impact jarring through his entire body. For a moment, he lay there, gasping for breath, his eyes closed against the harsh, blinding light of the sun. The house's heartbeat was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pounding of his own heart in his ears. The oppressive darkness, the cold, malevolent energy, they were all gone, left behind in the ruins of the house that had tried to destroy him. When he finally opened his eyes, Matt found himself lying in the middle of a desolate field, the crumbling remains of the house looming behind him. The air was fresh and cool, the sky above A brilliant blue that seemed almost unreal after the darkness he had endured. He had made it. He was free. But as he lay there, staring up at the sky, Matt knew that the nightmare wasn't truly over. The house might be destroyed, its power broken, but the memories of what he had experienced, the terror, the darkness, the twisted malevolence that had nearly consumed him, would stay with him forever. And as he pushed himself to his feet, staggering away from the ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling that something of the house had followed him out, that the darkness had left its mark on him, and that it was only a matter of time before it found him again. The sun was shining brightly as Matt walked away from the crumbling ruins of the house, but the warmth of the day did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. His footsteps were unsteady, his body aching from the ordeal he had just endured. He forced himself to keep moving, to put as much distance between himself and the house as possible. But the weight of what had happened hung over him like a dark cloud. The field he was walking through was eerily silent, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the tall grass. The house loomed behind him, its once imposing structure reduced to a pile of rubble and debris. But even in its ruined state, it still exuded an air of malevolence, as if the dark energy that had inhabited it lingered in the broken stones and splintered wood. Matt stopped for a moment, turning back to look at the remains of the house. The sight of it filled him with a deep, bone-chilling dread. The memories of what he had seen and experienced within its walls flashed through his mind, the twisted figures, the pulsing heartbeat, the altar of sacrifice. It was as if the house was still watching him, waiting for an opportunity to draw him back into its depths. But the house was dead, its power broken. He had survived. He had escaped. So why did he still feel like something was terribly wrong? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of fear that clung to his thoughts. He had to focus on getting back to civilization, finding help, and putting as much distance between himself and this place as possible. But as he turned to continue walking, a nagging sense of unease crept into his mind, a feeling that he was being watched, followed. Matt quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence of the field seemed to press in on him, amplifying the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of his footsteps on the dry earth. He couldn't shake the feeling that the house had left a mark on him, that its dark influence had somehow escaped with him. But that was impossible. The house was gone, destroyed. There was nothing left to fear. So why did he feel like the nightmare was far from over? After what felt like hours of walking, Matt finally reached the outskirts of a small town. The sight of it should have filled him with relief, but instead, he felt a growing sense of dread. The town was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and the streets were empty. The buildings were old and weathered, their paint peeling and their windows dark. It was as if the town had been abandoned, left to decay just like the house he had escaped from. Matt's heart sank as he realized that Jake was still out there somewhere, lost in the nightmare that had nearly consumed them both. He had to find him, to make sure his friend was safe, but he had no idea where to start. The town was a maze of narrow streets and alleys, each one more desolate and foreboding than the last. He wandered through the empty streets, calling out Jake's name, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the faint echo of his own voice. Matt's fear began to grow, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at him since he left the house intensifying with each step he took. Just as he was about to give up hope, he heard a faint noise, a soft, shuffling sound coming from a nearby alley. Matt's heart leaped in his chest as he ran toward the sound, his voice trembling as he called out, "Jake? Is that you?" The shuffling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the alley, and Matt's breath caught in his throat. It was Jake. But something was wrong. Jake's clothes were torn and dirty, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, once full of life and energy, were now dull and empty, like he was barely aware of his surroundings. He stood there, swaying slightly, as if it took all his strength just to stay on his feet. "Jake." Matt ran to his friend, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Jake, are you okay? What happened to you?" Jake's eyes slowly focused on Matt, but there was no recognition in them. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a low, guttural moan. Matt's blood ran cold as he realized that the Jake he knew was gone, replaced by something else, something that had followed them out of the house. "Jake, we have to get out of here," Matt said, his voice shaking. "We need to find help." But Jake didn't respond. He just stood there, staring blankly at Matt, his body trembling with a strange, unnatural energy. Matt's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to pull Jake away, but his friend resisted, his feet rooted to the ground as if he were tethered to the spot. "Jake, please," Matt pleaded, panic rising in his voice. "We have to go." But Jake didn't move. His eyes glazed over, and his body stiffened, as if something was taking hold of him, controlling him. Matt watched in horror as Jake's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. Matt stumbled back, his mind reeling with fear and disbelief. This wasn't Jake, this was something else, something that had taken his friend and turned him into a puppet of the house's dark power. And then, without warning, Jake lunged at him, his hands outstretched, his mouth open in a silent scream. Matt's reflexes kicked in, and he barely managed to dodge Jake's grasp, stumbling backward as his friend, or whatever had taken over his friend, continued to advance on him. Jake's movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The sickly glow in his eyes burned brighter, and his twisted grin widened as he closed in on Matt. "Jake, stop!" Matt shouted, but there was no recognition in Jake's eyes, no sign that the friend he had known was still in there. It was as if the house had hollowed him out, leaving behind only a shell animated by its dark will. Matt's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to escape. He couldn't bring himself to hurt Jake, but he knew he had to get away before it was too late. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, and then he saw it, a narrow alleyway that led to a side street. Without thinking, Matt turned and sprinted toward the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear Jake's footsteps pounding the pavement behind him, growing louder and more frantic with each passing second. The alley was tight, the walls closing in on him as he ran, but he forced himself to keep moving, his legs burning with the effort. The side street was just ahead, and Matt could see a narrow gap between two buildings, a possible hiding spot, a chance to lose Jake and buy himself some time. He pushed himself harder, the sound of Jake's pursuit spurring him on. He reached the gap and threw himself into it, pressing his back against the cold, rough brick wall as he tried to catch his breath. His heart was hammering in his chest, and he struggled to keep his breathing quiet, praying that Jake wouldn't find him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of Jake's footsteps came closer, echoing through the narrow alley. Matt held his breath, his entire body tense with fear as he listened to his friend's erratic movements. Jake passed by the gap without noticing it, his steps faltering as he continued down the alley. Matt watched him go, his heart aching with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Whatever had taken over Jake had turned him into something unrecognizable, something dangerous. Matt knew he couldn't help him, not now. When Jake was out of sight, Matt slipped out of the gap and back onto the side street. He had to keep moving, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he made his way through the empty, desolate streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house's influence had followed him here. That it was still hunting him, using Jake as its instrument. The town felt like a maze, every street and alley blending together in a confusing, disorienting labyrinth. Matt's mind raced as he tried to remember the way out, but every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the heart of the town, further from any hope of escape. Just as he was beginning to despair, he saw a flicker of movement up ahead, someone standing at the edge of the street, their back turned to him. Matt's heart leaped in his chest. Could it be someone who could help? Someone who wasn't under the house's control? He approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. As he drew closer, the figure turned, and Matt's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, tall and thin, with dark hair and a familiar, cold smile. Ethan. Supposed to be gone, consumed by the house's power. So how was he standing here, in the middle of this desolate town, looking as calm and composed as ever? Ethan's smile widened as he took a step toward Matt, his eyes gleaming with that same predatory hunger. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "You can't escape the house, Matt." "Not really." Matt took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you talking about? I destroyed it. I escaped." Ethan chuckled, the sound sending a shiver down Matt's spine. "You may have escaped its walls, but the house is more than just a building. It's a force, a presence that seeps into the minds of those it touches. You brought it with you, Matt. It's inside you now." Matt shook his head, refusing to believe what Ethan was saying. "No, that's not true. I'm free. I made it out." "Did you?" Ethan's voice was cold, taunting. "Or did the house let you go, knowing that its influence would still be with you, that it would haunt you for the rest of your life? You can't run from it, Matt. You can't hide. The house will always be with you, in your mind, in your dreams. It's a part of you now." Matt's hands clenched into fists as he fought to control the rising tide of panic. "You're lying," he said, his voice trembling. "You're just trying to scare me." Ethan's smile faded, his expression becoming more serious. "I don't need to scare you, Matt. You're already scared. You've seen what the house can do, how it twists reality, how it feeds on fear. And now, it's feeding on you." Matt felt a cold wave of dread wash over him as Ethan's words sank in. He had felt the house's influence ever since he escaped, the lingering sense of unease, the feeling of being watched. But he had convinced himself it was just his imagination, the after-effects of the trauma he had endured. Now, he wasn't so sure. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes locked on Matt's. "You can't fight it, Matt. The house is too powerful. It's in your mind, warping your thoughts, making you see things that aren't real. It will drive you mad, just like it did with Jake, just like it did with me." Matt's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. Was Ethan telling the truth? Was the house still inside him, controlling him, even now? "I won't let it take me," Matt said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "I won't let it win." Ethan's smile returned, cold and mocking. "It's too late, Matt. You've already lost." And with that, Ethan vanished, dissolving into the shadows like a wisp of smoke. The street around Matt seemed to warp and twist, the buildings distorting and melting into strange, nightmarish shapes. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the sky above darkened, turning a sickly shade of green. Matt's mind spun as he realized that he was still trapped in the house's influence, that the nightmare wasn't over. The town, the streets, even Jake, none of it was real. It was all part of the house's twisted game, a maze designed to keep him trapped in its dark web. He had never truly escaped. The house had followed him, infiltrated his mind, and now it was unraveling his reality, one thread at a time. As the world around him continued to warp and shift, Matt's sense of reality began to crumble. The buildings twisted into grotesque, impossible shapes, their walls bending and curving in ways that defied logic. The ground beneath him heaved and buckled, and the sky above swirled with dark, churning clouds. Matt stumbled through the chaos, his mind reeling as he tried to hold on to some semblance of sanity. But the house's influence was too strong, its dark power wrapping around his thoughts, warping his perceptions. He couldn't tell what was real and what was just another one of the house's illusions. He saw Jake again, standing at the edge of the twisted street, his eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. But when Matt tried to reach him, Jake vanished, replaced by Ethan's mocking smile, his voice echoing in Matt's mind. "You can't escape, Matt. The house will always be with you. It's in your mind, your thoughts, your dreams. It will drive you mad." Matt's head throbbed with pain as the house's dark influence seeped deeper into his consciousness. He could feel it twisting his memories, making him doubt everything he had ever known. Was any of this real? Had he ever truly escaped the house, or had he been trapped in its dark grasp all along? The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a yawning chasm filled with writhing shadows. Matt tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move, as if they were rooted to the ground. The shadows reached out for him, their cold, clammy fingers wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the edge. Matt struggled against their grip, but the harder he fought, the tighter they held on. His mind screamed in terror as the chasm widened, swallowing the twisted remnants of the town, leaving only darkness in its wake. And then, with a final, desperate cry, Matt was pulled into the abyss. The fall felt endless, the darkness around Matt absolute. He could feel the house's presence all around him, its dark power wrapping around his mind like a suffocating shroud. His thoughts were jumbled, fragmented, as if the house was tearing them apart, piece by piece. He didn't know how long he fell, time had lost all meaning. But eventually, the sensation of falling stopped, and Matt found himself lying on a cold, hard surface. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Matt tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as if the house had drained him of all his strength, leaving him a hollow shell, just like Jake, just like Ethan. The realization filled him with a deep, all-consuming despair. He had failed. He had tried to escape, to fight the house's influence, but in the end, it had won. It had taken everything from him, his sanity, his friends, his very sense of reality. And now, it was going to take his mind, just as it had with so many others before him. Matt's thoughts grew hazy as the darkness closed in, his mind unraveling under the house's relentless assault. The last thing he saw was a pair of glowing eyes staring down at him, filled with a cold, predatory hunger. And then, there was nothing.